Welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist. Ask the Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee, and back with us again, we have our head coach, Chad Zimmerman.
Hi, everybody.
Good to have you, Chad.
Thanks.
Nate Pearson is not with us
No.
today. Instead, we have Cliff Bar Racing and TrainerRoad's Pete Morris.
How's it going, guys?
We're happy to have you on too, Pete.
I'm glad to have Chad back, too.
It's great. Yeah. We're all happy to have him back. Speaking of that, Chad.
My week felt lopsided.
Yeah, for sure. We haven't had the gang, so to speak, back together in quite a while. But next week that'll happen. At least that's the plan. So yeah. Chad, where were you? We should talk about that.
I went to British Columbia to do some backcountry touring.
To Powder Creek Lodge.
Powder Creek Lodge. It's just a little outside of Caslow, if you're familiar with the area. Or is it Caslow?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where we went last year, and I'm very jealous that I didn't go this year.
Another week with the Peachels.
Oh.
It was as memorable as last year. So
pretty sweet,
incredible on so many levels.
So let's touch on this, I guess, kind of quickly. Some things that I guess you can kind of glean, because first of all, that's a week off of training, and one like structured training on the bike.
Yeah.
But it's no vacation. That's
no,
for sure.
it was a planned cross training base block. I mean, and it lived up to every aspect. And then some.
Yeah, so let's cover those kind of principles, so then we can draw some context for people that may be doing something that's cross-training-esque, or even if it's just like a week off that's physical in one regard or another. You know?
Yeah, so this wasn't, I knew it was coming from quite a ways out, so I did kind of structure training around it, leading up to it, so they didn't carry a bunch of fatigue into it, but that I also had a fair amount of fitness, because when we went last year, was not very fit, and it made a hard trip that much harder. So
it's hard.
Yeah,
it's
a hard day. It doesn't matter how fit you are. It's going to be a hard day. They're long days. But this year I carried some fitness into it, and it made a huge difference such that I'll be that much more motivated next year to carry more fitness into it.
Did you do mostly you almost did purely cycling going into it, right?
That's all I did.
Yeah.
A little bit I was walking to the store, which sounds like not much, but I live in a very hilly neighborhood,
uphill.
and walking is really similar to skinning up a whatever grade trail.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's a lot of parallel there. So, carried good fitness into it, and then knowing that it was going to be a big week, this was going to be a base week, and that's what I was after. So obviously, I'm there for the skiing, and I want to become a better skier, but I knew that the conditioning aspect of it was going to be a big boost to my aerobic capacity.
I noticed that last year, because we were probably doing, like I said, like 8 hours a day, roughly, more or less.
I think our shortest day was 6 hours. We went for longer days this year.
Yeah, so that's a lot of volume in terms of physical activity. You're carrying probably 50 pounds of total stuff on you at
quite a
any
lot of
point
gear.
with skis and everything else. And you're going up steep stuff, and then when you go down, it's
There's
difficult.
no breaks. There's no breaks, because even when you transition from the uphill to the downhill, you're not moving frantically, but you're moving. You're constantly moving. There's like a couple breaks here and there, but for the most part, when you set out in the morning till you come back in the evening or the late afternoon, you're doing a bit of work.
Yeah, so I noticed last year, like halfway through it, I was like, wow, this is really tiring. This is really hard. And then both of us came back last year from it. And then, I don't know, at least I felt like after a week's worth of workouts, it was like my body was like, oh yeah, now I can use all of this aerobic conditioning that you did here for this week. Now I can actually use it to make you faster on the bike. It wasn't like I was instantly faster.
No. And I actually have several, literally, I don't know, a few takeaways, and that is one of the things I want to talk about.
Sure.
So first off, like I said, this was a base block, plain and simple. I knew it going in, and I made sure that it lived up to my expectations. And what I'm after there is obviously the physiologic base adaptations, but there's a huge mental or motivation aspect to it. And I liken it to when you do a base block, you're kind of like a snowball at the top of a snowy hill, and you roll the snowball down and it gets bigger, right? Going into something like this and doing something this extensive was more like taking the base of a snowman, so more like a snow boulder, and setting it at the top of that same hill. So from the start, my motivation's way up. I know coming back, I've got a lot to build on already.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it's low intensity in nature. So just like you talked about, maybe a week or so, and I'm about 5 days out, and I'm starting to feel good again. Yesterday was like, didn't feel great, but it's coming back quickly. Now, if I thrashed myself with like a full-on training camp, even a base training camp on the bike, probably would have taken me slightly longer. So this is it's low impact, and the rebound is quick. There's also an injury recovery and prevention aspect to it. I carried a glute medius injury into it from just one bad front squat with uncentered hips. In any case, this was a muscle that was kind of primary to the sort of movement I was going to be doing, hiking up the hills with skis on.
Yeah.
But it was low impact and steady in nature, so it basically was just blood perfusion. I mean, just blood flow the whole time. So it's exactly what I needed to be doing rather than sitting around letting it tighten up and spasm.
Yeah, I feel like also just the cadence, because it's not like everyone's going really slow, but also nobody's tearing legs off going up climbs.
No, not at all. Days too long.
Yeah, so like I found that at that pace, it was really effective for me to be able to kind of focus on what my body was doing. Mm-hmm. So like I could, and
you can be
kind
very
of like
deliberate and conscious in your actions.
Right. So like if you have a glute med issue and you want to focus on it, want to whatever you want to do with it, it felt like it was kind of easy to do that.
Well, yeah, and along those lines, I mean, it's an opportunity for you to actually practice muscle activation for some muscles a lot of muscles that get neglected on the bike.
Yeah.
Even though they're lower body, you don't use your glutes like you do when you're skinning up a hill and really trying to extend the hip.
Yeah.
You don't use your stabilizers in your hips hardly at all on the bike, but you certainly do when you're going from ski to ski, either uphill or downhill. And there's just your hip flexors, for instance. Yeah, they're applied on the bike, but they're not taxed like they are when you're trying to push a ski in front of you.
Yeah.
Many times.
That's like the main thing that I've noticed with people that do cross-country skiing too, but especially touring when you're carrying weight, doing that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And because the movement is just, straight in front of you rather than moving outward like cross-country skiing, the like hip flexor tends to let go on people very quickly because of that very thing. I think that if you don't focus on activation and making sure that you're using everything that you should be doing, they can take the brunt of what you do there.
In particular, you can really overwork your hip flexors if you're not using your glutes. I mean, you should be extending those hips to get up the hill. You shouldn't be lifting that leg in front of you or throwing it in front of you. That kind of takes care of itself. If that's the conscious action, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, in my mind... so that just like anything else, whenever we see ourselves on camera, we're far less impressive. Like, who is that?
I don't even like to watch myself on camera. It's just deflating.
In my mind, I'm picturing when I'm touring up, like my leg, like Kipchogeing behind me, right? Like long angle, long, pointed direction behind me. I'm sure it's not anything remotely close to that, but it's really helpful, I find, because I'm doing the exact opposite when I'm on the bike. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And for me, that's one of the main issues that I found where like, if you're going to try to tie a chain to the injuries that I've experienced with knee injuries, everything else, that's one of the key points in that chain. So not lengthening it effectively. So, yeah.
So on top of all the base type training you do, the low intensity, low impact stuff, there's also a sprinkling of anywhere from moderate to highly taxing anaerobic stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, the downhills, especially if you're an aggressive skier, can be pretty anaerobic. I mean, pretty strength
as hard
oriented.
as you can go. Let's be totally honest.
And when you crash, the hardest thing in the world is to get out of snow.
I call it falling because it sounds a little less dramatic, and I do it a lot. And getting up in deep powder is a total body exercise. Every time. Hard. And it gets a little harder each time in the same day.
It's like quicksand too, because like, you put your hand down and you try to push, then that sinks. So then like you just can't,
there are techniques.
You just pulled the airbag every time, right?
I wanted to so bad. I was like, I wonder if it would dig me out right now.
That's funny.
And then, and then there's a fat loss component, so kind of a body composition component, and it really doesn't matter how much you eat on these trips because you're so active you can only eat so much, and then when you get home in the evening you only have so much time to do damage in terms of intake. So you get a couple benefits out of that. I mean, my body composition, my side pockets are smaller, so I know I lost some body fat, and then a little bit of carbohydrate acclimation. I'm not a high carbohydrate eater, but on these trips I eat a ton of carbohydrates, so when I come back I got like this little glycolytic kick. Those enzymes are kind of revving up. So now I can jump into higher intensity work that are a little more glucose necessitating in nature. And I'm kind of primed to do so.
It's like your body is ready to be fueled, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. Simple way. And then finally, and perhaps the most importantly, honestly, is the mental reset. As John Peachel, one of the owners and operators of the lodge, commented on one of my Strava rides, that's exactly what it is. And that's what I wanted to get across more than anything else, because there's a number of aspects of that. And one is that the technology is minimized. So, laptops and cell phones aren't even allowed on the base level or on the lodge level, because you're supposed to be down there to socialize and engage and not, just hide in your phone the whole trip.
You kind of don't have time for it.
No,
even,
yeah.
And you, of course you don't have service because you're way in the middle of the mountain.
Yeah, that's true too. I mean, you get a bit of service, but it's scheduled tightly. And then like I tried to use my Garmin so that I could at least get altitude and how long I'm out there, but the buttons on the Garmin and the movements you make, I'm turning that thing on and off all the time. So that's basically useless data. I tried to hook a stride up to my running power meter to my ski boot. There's no good way to do it, and the likelihood of losing it was pretty high. So I abandoned that and just went no tech.
So that's kind of like a nice, because we, especially here at TrainerRoad, everything that we do is very much around that.
I'd like to have that data. I mean, I wouldn't mind it.
Yeah.
Sure.
But it was also nice to kind of cut loose of that, that not requirement. But that,
there's silver linings to it, right? Like there can be a mental reset component to that for sure.
And then just the simple act of physical activity for the joy of it, for no other reason. Just to go out there and do something because it's fun is a mental reset in its own way. The challenge of it, and it's challenging in so many different ways, especially if you're not a particularly good skier. I won't say it's terrifying. It was terrifying last year. This year it was just kind of scary, and we crested like midweek to the point where the fear was being more outweighed by the fun. So that shift is a necessary one. The socialization, huge psychological impacts of socializing with a bunch of people, especially new people, interesting conversations. I mean, these are well-traveled people who obviously have similar interests. So you do a lot of talking. And normally that doesn't suit me too well, but in this environment, it really does. And you come back refreshed in that way as well. It's a real tester of relationships. So I take my fiance into it. We go together. So I mean, that's kind of a make or break. Something that's as scary and as difficult as this for two kind of novice skiers, intermediate skiers, can be very telling in terms of the strength of your relationships. So that's kind of a side plus
for sure.
And then super narrow focus. I mean, there's only really one thing to concentrate on. There aren't 100 things coming at you. You really just go out and ski, and that's your day. And you come back and recover, and you get up the next day and do it again. So it's cleansing in that manner as well.
You could apply a lot of these principles to when you do like a training block. Like
For
if
sure.
anybody
That's
takes like
exactly
any sort
what
of,
I'm driving at here.
I think that it can help a lot. I have a training block planned for the final week of April into May.
Do you plan to leave Dodge?
Park City, Utah.
Yeah.
So change circumstance, go there and train and I actually, like, this is kind of making me think, like, maybe what I do for that week is I put away all sorts of, I put away tech, put away everything else.
Honestly,
unplug as much as possible.
The greater the departure, the more you can focus on the thing that you're supposed to be focused on.
Yeah, because I think that it would improve the quality of the training that I have throughout that week. And I have a week thereafter of vacation that I have planned. So that's going to be like time to absorb it. So I might as well do as much as I can to get the most out of it. So
agreed.
Cool. Well, good to have you back, Chad.
Yeah, good to be back.
Yeah, all three of us are going next year for the
we
same
are.
week.
In a year from now, like 362 days or 1 days.
Not counting or anything.
No, it's not there about it.
Amber, she actually had a request. So she was at it's called Borrego Camp, as BORREGO Camp, and that's actually put on by Janae Spilker, and she's Janelle Spilker. Yeah, in Borrego Springs. Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah. So they call it Borrego Camp, and Janelle Spilker, she's an ex-pro cyclist, and she's awesome. I've done a handful of long rides with her, and she is like one of the most fun people. Anyways, Amber was like one of the guest, I think, athletes there at that camp, which is really cool. So there are a couple podcast listeners that she rode with that she wanted to shout out. So first of all, Julian and Alyssa. And Mark, because all three of you were at the camp. So shout out to you for listening to the podcast and for going on awesome rides with Janelle and Amber and doing all that stuff. It's pretty great. We raced this weekend. You and I did, Pete, and Nate.
Yeah.
We should probably. So there are some spoilers that we don't want to spoil. With this. But maybe share some takeaways from it. I guess the first thing is you can go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TrainerRoad.
And you can see the first race that we already published.
Exactly. And there's one that's that Tucker's working on right now, another one, and then we're going to be working on another one. It's just happening.
Yeah,
so
race season's here. Just like that.
So what key points do we want to share on this one?
You raced 3 times in a day.
I did.
Which a lot of people end up doing multiple races in a day.
With a criterion.
Yeah, let's talk about what you had to tackle doing multiple races in a day.
Yeah, eating between the races was like one thing I thought of beforehand. And first of all, the morning of even, I actually just did like a lot of what I usually eat before race day morning is just rice and eggs. A little bit like, if for example, it'll be like 2 cups of rice with like 1 egg. So it's not like a bunch of eggs in there, but rice and eggs. And I brought over a gigantic Tupperware of that morning, and I ate it on the way when I was driving over to the race, and then did the race. And then after that, I ate that in between the races. They even had like, I ran out of that before the 3rd race, but there was a Chipotle nearby, so rice. It was perfect.
Oh,
so I
yeah.
got rice. I did not get like queso sauce.
Wow. Can you put a layer of queso on the bottom? Then rice, then queso, then rice.
Then more and sprinkle of queso. So just rice. But I found that it was, like always, so hard to eat. Like nothing about me wanted to eat after doing an all-out crit effort, right? But it's really helpful because my energy levels never felt low throughout the day. And I didn't have to take in like a bunch of like, I wasn't taking in bars or blocks or anything else like that. I had the Mar10 drink mix in my bottle when I was racing. And then I had a caffeinated gel in the morning. Yeah. And that kept me ripping for all day because I don't usually take in caffeine, right? And then I just had the rice in between. But it was hard, and I had to be very disciplined too. So like I just went back to my truck and I sat down, and then I actually took the NBC Sports Gold, and there was the Hahnenkamm downhill was happening. So I just watched downhill skiing the whole time in between races, and then went out and raced my bike back to skiing. But it was hard, like to be disciplined with eating, and then also disciplined and not going around doing a bunch of stuff in between or talking
and like cheering
schmoozing,
and
cheering.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Do you feel there was a break point, like maybe 2 races was productive, 3 was not?
Yeah. Yeah. 3rd race. So 2nd race was harder than I intended it to be. Things unfolded and I let my leash go a little bit, right? And so it was harder than I intended. And then the 3rd race was extremely hard just by nature. Okay. It was the P123 race. Oh, yeah. And with some really heavy hitters hitting very heavily. So that made it really difficult. And yeah, it was like the 3rd race, I was cooked for that sort of intensity.
One of the things I noticed is since you fueled so well and you did have an easier race, then a medium race, then a hard race, your intensity actually stayed high the whole time. Or right, you were able to produce intense efforts the whole time. Then the lights went out, but that's to be expected, right? After 3 hours of racing in a day, you just don't have it anymore. But up until the point when the lights went out, you were still moving and shaking, right?
Yeah. And one thing I did before the races, so before before all 3 races, I did a small warm up. And I follow the same warm-up protocol now for almost everything. I'll alter it slightly depending on how I feel, but it's usually 10 minutes of like easy stuff, like, like low zone 2. And then after that, I just ramp up. Every 30 seconds, I'll ramp up 10 watts, or every minute, I'll ramp up 10 watts, right? Depending on how I feel. And then I get to the point where I get like up to like 120%. And then after that, I'll just spike it up really quick and then ramp it down. So it usually takes like 15 minutes to do something like that. It's not very hard. But then I found that I was just making it slightly shorter, but I still did that same warm up, brought my rollers because it made it easy. I didn't do it before the 3rd race, and I honestly felt like I felt like during the warm up there, I put in more time than I would have, and I probably also pedaled harder than I would have too.
Yeah, when we were riding together.
So I probably didn't need to do that. Would have been better just to stick to the structure. But I think that's another key. Like, you can't just race once, and then when you have 3-hour gaps in between your races, think you can just get right back into it the next time. Like, you're going to feel cold, like not warmed up. Yeah. So that was one interesting thing. One other thing, so I raced a 3-4 race, a 3 race, and a P123 race. And the worst cornering that I saw all day, because there's like one chicane where if you're a good corner or not, it makes a big difference, actually.
Makes a big difference, yeah.
And the worst cornering that I saw all day was in the P123 race. Like slowest, worst lines. Big field, yeah, but not necessarily any bigger, actually smaller than the 3-4 field. And interestingly, the 3-4 was, they were actually faster through the turn, smoother, better line.
Is that because of the disparity in capabilities between the 1s and the 3s?
Strange. I don't necessarily think so. Because the 3s, we were much faster through the turns as well. It's kind of, I guess that the thing that makes that interesting is the fact that there's an assumption that, like, certainly bike skill of all things increases as you go up, or, you know, a person's ability to technically handle anything like that. But that's not necessarily true, right? Like, and in this case, there were other reasons, I think, that why it was slower. But it's also important that we remember that just because somebody is a Cat 1 doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is better than, which we'll talk about here, a novice, right? Which used to be Cat 5. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily better than them at something on the bike. And
I think...
why do you think it was slower?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit. I think there's one or two things that really underline what was happening. Our race was really fast when it was fast, and the overall speed wasn't super high. So when it was hard, it was extra hard.
Okay.
And so you kind of lose your mental capacity to corner well when you're on the limit. And most people were on the limit a lot of the race. And so you just don't set up for corners as well when you're thinking about, if I'm going to be able to pedal 5 more times, period.
5 more than done.
So, and the same kind of split in the field. I think having a 1, 2, 3 race has more filler in the race, which is just the way it is. So the people who were really racing the 1, 2, 3 race, there was more like aggression in the front, in the corner, to get to the corner correctly and through correctly. And so that kind of jostles everybody behind and scares everybody behind, and it reverberates back through the field.
Also, it slowed down, I feel like, every time coming into that, because the gas would be on outside of it. And it honestly, for the heavy hitters that were in that race, that was kind of a good strategy in one regard, because it made everybody have to punch through that chicane because they had to slow down so much.
Yeah, it's a punishing way to ride a crit.
And then they'd punch us right after that.
Over and over.
So it's interesting, though. But like all of that aside, your line choice is not tied in directly to like, you know, your experience level or categorization or anything like that. You know, it's interesting.
The old adage is, I've been behind many guys who got paid money to ride their bicycle who couldn't go around a corner fast to save their life. But they can sure sprint out of the next one, right?
so it evens out.
It doesn't matter.
So that was interesting. And then, man, everybody knows this, right? But the front of the pack, when you have a race that's on, the front of the pack is so nice compared to the back. Just if you're suffering, we've talked about this plenty of times, and you can see points in the latest YouTube video that we have on for the race analysis video about pro tips on how to move efficiently through the field with you. And then we also talked about how to position yourself well in mind. And we talk about little things where when it slows down, what you do in order to improve your position, and little things to just kind of constantly make sure that you're not moving backward, but you're just either staying where you need to be or moving forward without causing, you know, a bunch of energy costs there. So because when I got to the back of that pack in the third race, it was so hard. So anyways, interesting stuff there. What do you say we jump down into Matt's question?
Let's do it.
Then we'll jump up to some things that we have up above there. So Matt says, started listening to the podcast recently and shortly afterwards subscribed to TrainerRoad to guide my 2020 training. Awesome. Welcome, Matt. Says, I'll be wrapping up my week 2 of Sweet Spot Base Low Volume 1. That's the first half of our base plans. And he says, with Antelope later today. That's like, basically, Antelope is like a steady state sweet spot workout where you're basically, I think it's somewhere around like 10.
I think it's 5 by 10.
5 by 10.
5 by 10.
Yep. So that's what that is. Perhaps my favorite feature of TR so far, besides the actual workouts, is the calendar. I love being able to adjust my plan day by day and week by week, as well as keep track of my non-TR rides and gym workouts all in one place. Yes, that's awesome, Matt. Planning, training, and analytics, not just training. So, says, which brings me to my question. I used to be an avid lifter when I was playing baseball in college. Since graduating 3 years ago, however, I've neglected strength training in favor of more recreational exercise, mainly hiking and biking. However, in wanting to take my cycling fitness more seriously going forward and perhaps start doing some racing, I've started to get back into the gym a couple days a week for 45 to 50-minute sessions. One thing I've noticed so far is that more than any other muscle group, my hamstrings are super sore in the few days after my workouts. I assume that the reason my hamstrings seem to be so relatively fragile is that the majority of my exercise over the past 3 years have been activities that ignored or neglected that muscle group. It may be relevant to point out that I don't work a desk job. I'm a carpenter, which I assume would exacerbate the issue. I'm picturing like bending over and working on things all day, you know?
I'd imagine so.
Yep. So 3 questions. These are great questions. Number 1, I've heard the phrase adaptive muscle shortening, and I'm doing this in air quotes right now if you're listening on the podcast. You can join us on YouTube for the live stream, by the way, Thursdays at 8 a.m. He says, I've heard the phrase adaptive muscle shortening used to blame the tight hips and hamstrings cyclists often experience. How much do you need to ride this to be an issue? Or how much do you need to ride for this to be an issue? And how can you combat it?
It doesn't have to be an issue at all. It doesn't matter how much you ride, as long as you address the fact that these muscles reside in a shortened state for a lot of time, and you counter that with lengthening. It's a non-issue. We might be getting to this in later questions, but I think the reason his hamstrings are sore is they're just undertrained, and he's getting back in the gym, and these muscles aren't used to being stressed, and now he's stressing them again. It's just a cycle you're going to go through with anything that doesn't see much attention, and then it starts getting attention. I mean, if you haven't done anything with your biceps and you go in and bang out a 30 rep set of biceps curls a few times over, they're going to be sore.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. So just because you're riding a bike doesn't mean you're going to have to suffer these shortened muscles. It's really easy to combat this, and consistency is really it. I mean, if you know you spend a lot of time in a shortened state, make sure you spend some time in a lengthened state. And he has a good fortune of, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, of being on his feet a lot, which means his hamstrings or at least aren't in as shortened a state as they would be if he were driving a truck for multiple hours a day or sitting at a desk. Even though desk people do have, and I think it's neglected, but they have the opportunity to get up and just do some walking, just stand for a while if you have a standing desk especially. But in any case, just counter it. Just make sure you spend some time lengthening those muscles. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a stretching session where you sit and do passive stretches or more active ones. Simply allowing those muscles to lengthen from time to time is really all it takes.
Yeah. An interesting point with this too, if you think about all the stuff that he's probably done with baseball, cycling, everything else, you probably experienced this very thing when you started cycling, Matt. This very thing when you started doing baseball, everything else. This is what happens when you work a new muscle group. Yeah. But a lot of the time we get, especially with those listening to this podcast, because chances are we're really focused on cycling, so we've been doing it for a while, focusing on that. We get completely blown out of the water as soon as we do anything different.
And he's doing probably the best thing he can do, and that he's getting into the gym and he's addressing these muscles in ways that aren't going to get addressed on the bike. Yeah. So he's rounding himself out as an athlete in general.
Because life happens, and if you're not like, I remember our fence blew down in the middle of like peak season 2 years ago, and I was trying, or 3 years ago, and I was trying to train. I was like, well, I gotta spend the day like digging out broken fence posts, put up new fence posts. I was basically bedridden for like 3 weeks.
But a real good bike rider.
Yeah, exactly.
I can spin my legs in really small circles really fast.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's
we get a bit myopic, that's for sure.
Yep.
I would say one thing is, if he just finished Sweet Spot Base 1, that means he's 6 weeks in. So he's been training for 6 weeks, which is right when you first begin to see what all the training is doing for you. So pay attention now and start to see how your body feels, and pay attention for the next 3 months and the next 6 months and the next year, and watch how your body transforms and starts adapting to the load you're putting on it.
It's the whole argument for strength training. One of the sides of it, right, is the sense that, making yourself a more well-rounded athlete that can respond to plenty of things. And it will make you a better bike rider as well.
It carries nicely. I mean, just a stronger body on the bike can do more things, can resist more fatigue, can ride more in a more controlled, less wasteful manner.
Yep. Let's go into a second question. What is the role of the hamstrings in the biomechanics of cycling? I assume that almost all of your power comes from your glutes and quads, but do the hamstrings perform some kind of auxiliary function, or are they there? Or are they just along for the ride? Yeah, that's a big It's
a pretty loaded question, actually.
Yes, exactly right. That's that's a good way to say it.
Yeah, we could debate this for hours, but
yeah,
I'm not going to debate it. I see it pretty narrowly.
Cool.
They can be along for the ride, or they can be active. How active you make them isn't really going to influence your power output or your longevity or your time to exhaustion and all these things that we really want to limit or control when we're on the bike. So if you just think of riding on platform pedals, there's no hamstring activation going on the platform. I mean, very little. Nothing that contributes to the pedal stroke, that's for sure.
Yeah, unless you've got like really grippy shoes with really grippy flats.
Yeah, it's pretty unlikely. The same thing goes with the hip flexors and all these other auxiliary muscles, as he puts it. And again, I mean, you can't emphasize them, but it's really just to round out the pedal stroke and make it a more coordinated movement, not really to derive more power. So in my opinion, they are along for the ride. I mean, this is a quad-driven muscle action for sure. I mean, when's the last time you did anything, whether it was a sprint, a long climb, anything where you were pushing the pedals that anything more than your quads was on fire. I mean, it's just, you might get cramps in your adductors or maybe occasional calf cramp, or even your hamstrings can cramp, but when your legs light up, it's obviously because your quads are driving that pedal stroke, and it's your quads that light up.
Yep. I can think of times when I felt like, ooh, my glutes are tired, or, oh, like this is tired. But when it comes to boiling points, like what you're talking about, like basically when you explode, when that happens, it's almost always tied in.
Yeah, and those muscles are active for sure. I mean, they all do their own form of contribution, and the glutes, are second to the quads for sure. I mean, that hip extension is absolutely a necessary component of a pedal stroke, but you have to consider how much our hips extend. I mean, even at the most extended point when we're out of the saddle, we're still canted forward, and we're only reaching, only what, 150? I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what it is, but it's not full extension.
Dozens of degrees left on the table.
Yeah, and the glutes get really strong as they become more and more shortened. And then if you extend them behind the body, like if you're in a plank position, a push-up position, and you do those leg lifts, then you can really feel your glute fire. But that's nothing you're going to experience on the bike ever.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So this is also a good point to kind of talk about, because I see, once again, this is a loaded one and also a hotly debated topic. I see a lot of people talk about the fact that, like, your hamstring is dominant from 6 to 9, right? And we're talking about like quadrants, if you imagine on a clock, like, quad from 1 to 3. And they basically like kind of as if your body is like past 3 o'clock, flip the switches, right? Yeah. And then it just uses this. And I think that's just because of how our brains work a lot of the time. We like to think of things in like binary relationships, where it's basically on or off. And it's also really convenient for us to kind of graph that in a quadrant to kind of figure it out in our minds.
And it looks pretty.
Yeah.
Super cool. You're thinking, okay, well, I need to strengthen my hamstrings if I want to be strong through this segment of the pedal stroke, and it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, so and it's just not, like you said, it's not necessarily the case, right? And we have like quadrant pedal drills where we'll walk you through in the workout text, where we'll ask you to emphasize at certain points different muscle groups and different, I guess I should say, like just different methods of pedaling as you go through a pedal stroke. And those are by no means saying that like this is what you should use in there. This is just us trying to basically teach you that you can pedal the bike in different manners.
Yeah, supple pedal stroke that's smooth throughout the entire 360 degrees. That's all we're after.
Especially as a new rider, the finesse in your pedal stroke isn't acquired just by thinking about it. It's by lots of pedaling and like trying different things and rounding out your pedal stroke by doing quadrant drills, and then over time, like the finesse coalesces in your legs, and you start pedaling better.
Especially for new riders, I think it's hard to recognize just how inefficient a pedal stroke can be if the other muscles aren't doing their jobs. If all you're doing is mashing the quads down, that's a lot of dead air or a lot of wasted movement. And it can get pretty sloppy if those are the only muscles really firing. There should be quite a lot else going on, but it's really more of a neuromuscular sort of coordination mechanism. It's not really a strength one or an endurance one, stamina one.
And it's different for every rider. And there are examples of fast riders that aren't as efficient, and examples of fast riders that are as efficient, and also the opposite with inexperienced riders. And it can also change from within one person. Like you said, Pete, like you can train that and then it starts to show up. But the principle of efficiency is absolutely there for everybody. And if more efficiency is gained, then you're just going to be more efficient.
You'd be surprised how economically you can make that rounded motion with a little bit of emphasis on the other aspects of the pedal stroke, not just the downstroke.
Yeah, so hopefully that answers the second question. His third one says, how should I focus on my hamstrings in the gym to enhance my cycling and offset any potential muscle shortening? Is it as simple as working them and getting them stronger, or should I also be focusing on flexibility or mobility somehow?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to exactly what we were just talking about. And I want every athlete to think less about conditioning the hamstrings to enhance cycling performance and more about creating or reinforcing and then steering an increasingly capable body towards being a faster rider. Yeah, you just make your body stronger, and this is all in the strengthening realm anyway, strength and coordination. Then you get on the bike, and that's where you cultivate the metabolic fitness and the particular movement efficiencies and that type of thing.
Yeah, I think there's like basically like when you see this, you're like work hamstring, so GHD machine, right? Like basically like
hundreds a day.
Yeah. If you don't know what a GHD machine is, you can look that up on YouTube, or maybe producer Tucker can link to one in the forum.
It's a glute ham developer, and it does that. It targets the glutes and the hamstrings, and it does a great job at it. But is that going to make you a better cyclist?
It's like
it's very arguable,
right? And it's also such a tied-in thing. If you in most cases, because once again, like you said, Chad, it's about creating a healthy body that can then cycle effectively as well. When you do that, I think that we're talking like, at least in my opinion, compound movements that are going to be training the athlete in a more dynamic manner rather than just like, a very single plane. This is exactly what's
it's
going
cliche,
on.
but you train movements, not muscles. That's how it works. I mean, if you're rehabbing something, you're going to train that muscle. If you're trying to learn a particular coordination, you might get really specific and isolated. But in general, you train movement patterns because the body works as a unit.
Yeah. And cycling is not, as everyone says, it's a single plane movement. I understand the concept of the fact that your legs are not moving. I mean, hopefully they're not moving in other directions.
Ideally.
That's pretty common to see though. But your hips aren't necessarily meant to work within like they aren't designed to just rotate in that and function in that manner when we're pedaling on a bike. It's actually a pretty complex thing for your hips to be able to do if your hips are remaining stable and to allow your legs to do that. So to think that, you just need to work your leg in a single motion when you're really doing a more complex motion than you think on the bike, I guess it just makes sense pairing things that are a little more apt for it. So
and then and do recognize, Matt, that if you can achieve a full range of motion, you can strengthen that full range of motion. Whether or not that strengthening will carry over to better cycling performance is neither here nor there. If you have the range of motion, then you can work on strengthening it. If, however, you don't have the range of motion, don't jump into strengthening movements. You first have to work your mobility. You first have to establish the full range of motion, and then you can load it and strengthen it. But if right now you have super tight hamstrings and you're just hopping on the leg curl machine and banging out reps that suit that range of motion, that limited range of motion, you're doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, get some sweet hammies though.
Well, and I do think
in a particular range,
I do think a lot of cyclists overestimate their flexibility and their range of motion. And so if you're really thinking about what you should do in the gym, definitely look at what your range of motion is before you start really working the strength stuff.
Yeah, because we work very narrow ranges. We just do. I mean, nothing. Our knees only open so wide. Our hips only open so wide. Even our ankles stay in a pretty narrow position relative to what they can do.
Yeah, we've talked about this plenty of times. We even had a podcast with him. But for mobility, range of motion, I can't recommend enough Kelly Starrett. The Ready State is the, you can look that up on Instagram and find that, and plenty of other stuff. He's just a fantastic resource on this, who also has a lot of experience working with everything from triathletes to cyclists to mountain bikers, and then every other sort of athlete. He's just a fantastic resource on this. His Instagram videos, he may be like the leading, in my opinion, like the leading useful Instagram content example that I can find. Really quick, doesn't waste your time, just gets straight into it and gives you the tips that you need.
He used to have to pay for those, and now he starts putting it. Now they're on Instagram. So for everybody who doesn't want to pay for another service,
there you go. Yeah,
it's super valuable.
Pete, last week we talked about nutrition, taking it in, solids versus non-solids.
Yeah, we did.
We should probably clarify because some people got or brought up some points in the forum. We should cover.
I think people got a little excited about the way we were talking about sticking to liquid-based calories like gels and blocks and calories in your bottle. We were definitely talking about working at the absolute highest intensity you can work at for an extended event. And that is racing, right? Like something you care about, it's really going to matter. That's when you steer someone towards that type of nutrition strategy.
Food in its most digestible form.
Exactly. Yeah. But for everything else, like all your regular Gran Fondos, anything you're not worried about winning, anything where you can stop, for sure, regular food always has its place. But yeah, when you're really dialing in something to work at your max capacity for a given duration, it's got to be that nutrition strategy.
It's not going to be a burger.
No, because it's not. It's not.
Unfortunately.
That pleasant.
Yeah. One thing with that though, so like longer events that are less intense, you don't have that outcome, everything else. Yeah, sure. Like you can do whatever you need, and it can be beneficial also to get yourself on more natural, less processed foods, everything else. But that said, there's the other side of things too. Like let's say that for me, for example, last year, I found that I was really bad at eating on the bike. So one of my goals, resolutions even, was to eat every time I was on the bike, but not just like eat whatever, but train myself to be better at taking in the food that I would take in on race day. And that's a key point. Sure. Because if you are just eating whatever, you eat, and then race day suddenly, okay, now I can't have solids, but I usually always eat solids. It's probably going to come to a shock to your gut when you put in food that it's never had before. Yeah. So you could argue that it's a good time in your less intense rides to start working that in strategically and to get your body used to processing that in any sort of state, but especially in one where you're in activity.
Recognize that it's intensity dependent. I mean, it doesn't it doesn't matter how quickly white bread with a little bit of jam on it metabolizes. If you're in the middle of a crit where you're gulping down air and you can barely get your hand to your bottle for a quick swig of water, you're not going to want anything that isn't as quickly assimilated as possible.
Yeah.
And I think nutrition, just like everything, requires training, right? Like from the most basic standpoint, training your body to cope with different types of food is a skill in itself and something you have to practice. So like John had to practice eating race food and getting used to ingesting large amounts of calories in a specific type of food that you didn't used to enjoy eating.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And now you can.
Yeah, exactly. Enjoy still, questionable, but just the same. It's extremely effective and it makes me enjoy racing more.
Yeah. And so think of it as like another feather in your cap to put in. If you have the option of doing multiple nutrition strategies for a given duration, you're going to be that much more robust of a cyclist, period.
Yep. Yeah.
Right.
Couldn't agree more. Dustin's question. He says, I'm a long-time listener, but first-time question asker. I like that. It's good. Yeah. Says, love the podcast. My question for years, I've been primarily a marathon mountain bike racer, which I figure we should probably clarify what that is too, because a lot of the time we talk about XCM or XC marathon MTB. And by classification, that's usually 3 hours plus. But really what that means in this context usually is longer mountain bike rides. That's like longer than something that's 90 minutes and really intense, like cross-country Olympic, that discipline. This is something that's longer. So that's what that means for all those that aren't familiar with that. So I've been primarily a marathon mountain bike racer and usually pick 1 or 2 big races a year to focus on. That's really similar for most people that are marathon mountain bikers. I'm an 8-hour Leadville guy and race Cat 1 XC, so I'm fairly quick at long-distance races. Typically, after mountain bike season, I start transitioning to short, more intense training sessions, and I race cyclocross. I've realized that cross is my true love, and for 2020, I want cross to be my primary focus. My question is, does racing marathon mountain bike races, and he says in this case 4+ hours, all summer help my cyclocross training, or would I be better off doing shorter and more intense races in the summer and focus on 1 to 2 hour training sessions instead of 4 to 6 hours? Maybe even do some crits. Thanks for taking my call. I'll hang up and listen.
That's awesome.
I like that.
Okay, so before we get super specific to Dustin's question, let's just consider first, there's a reason why professional riders put in big weeks, 30+ hour weeks in some cases. There's a reason why riders who simply ride lots and don't have any real structure to their riding actually gain, surprisingly high levels of fitness. There's a reason why base training exists, why volume camps are peppered throughout the competitive season, between competitive seasons. Aerobic capacity. I mean, these aerobic adaptations build benefits for any endurance athlete in any discipline. And I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that short races, even if it's a 30-minute, it could be a 10-minute time trial with a 10-mile time trial with a fast rider who does it in 20 minutes. These are definitely endurance events. Really, anything over a couple minutes, it's an endurance event. So the bigger your aerobic capacity, your aerobic base, all these things that go with it, which I'll talk briefly about, the better.
Can I provide some context for that really quick? Because I find that us cyclists tend to segment it too much, and we're basically like, criterium, cyclocross, it's all anaerobic. And then everything else is aerobic after that. Take a step out and look at it from the perspective of an average person. And they go to the gym and then they do, a set where it's basically like 2 or 3 reps. And then that's it. And then that we're talking about anaerobic movements, right? And exercises. That's something very different.
Watch Usain Bolt.
Yes.
That's mostly anaerobic.
If you were to ask them to then lift for 20 minutes, they would be like, you're insane. I'm not going to do a 20-minute set.
Yeah, even with a 5-pound weight.
Yes,
doesn't matter. You cannot do it.
Yeah. So this is the difference that we're talking about. Within our sport, our sport is aerobic. It is. It also has anaerobic demands in it too, for sure.
Aerobic sport.
But it's an aerobic sport. Yeah.
Yep. So, and what does that mean? Or what are we after when we're talking about aerobic adaptations? And we've talked about this many, many times, but I'm just going to do a quick review. So what we're primarily after is more mitochondria, which basically allow us to turn over more energy. It just lightens the metabolic load. So you just think there are more workers in the factory. Okay. So more distribution of the workload. More capillaries, so that's the blood delivery and the waste removal and the oxygen, of course. More aerobic enzymes, so you can metabolize energy aerobically. So again, all to an aerobic end. Greater lactate tolerance. The more mitochondria you have, the more pyruvate doesn't back up and become lactate, or more lactate you can process. Either way, better lactate tolerance. And then the list goes on. That's just a few things, but just to remind ourselves, all these aerobic benefits benefit any form of endurance sport.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying like criteriums and cross-country marathon races.
Absolutely. Yeah. It doesn't matter how much you pepper your events with anaerobic efforts. You're always relying on your aerobic base.
So in this case, answering his question directly, and we'll get into more science on this, but answering the question directly with that.
Well, yeah. See, that's the beauty of this. All these aerobic adaptations I just described, and then a lot of them that I did not, can be achieved in so many ways. Mm-hmm. You can do them with long, slow distance, which is kind of what he's talking about here, 4 to 6 hours. You can do them with sweet spot work. You can do them with all forms of high intensity interval training, from short to long VO2 max to intermittent, so the shorts, to sprint intensity training. Even though it looks like I'm sprinting, how can that possibly be aerobic? The signaling that takes place, the benefits that follow, very aerobic. Mm-hmm. Living at altitude or doing hypoxic training. Mm-hmm. These are things that can influence it. Circuit training. I mean, get in a CrossFit gym or just do a really tough circuit. That's a huge aerobic demand, and what follows is aerobic adaptation. Mm-hmm. Ski touring, for instance. I mean, we just talked about that.
Yep.
There's a lot of forms of cross training. Mm-hmm. And they all, if you drag them out and you keep steady stress on the system, you're going to get aerobic adaptation.
Yep, absolutely.
If it exceeds what you're already used to, of course.
And of course, there's the principle of specificity, right? Like where, when we're talking about what you're going to do on race day.
Yeah.
It's important to make sure that you're training what you're going to be using on race day.
And you get to that as you move through a training cycle. Mm-hmm. You move from phase to phase to phase, and it grows increasingly specific, such that by the time you roll around, you're not so focused. Roll around to your events, you're not so focused on building up this massive aerobic base so much as tailoring your fitness to the specific demands you're going to face in your events. So
like exactly. There's a time for that specificity, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And then we key on this quite often, but it's about training energy systems. We're not looking for particular durations, if I want to be a fast crit racer, I have to have a really strong 1 minute, a really strong 2 minute, a really strong sprint. I have to have all these things. Well, actually, you have to have a strong aerobic capacity, and you need to be able to exploit your anaerobic side of things frequently. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So energy systems.
Yeah, exactly. That's our approach to training, right? And yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. I mean, it really is. So, Pete, you have some personal advice for him?
Well, I said it makes it more fun if you kind of do that specificity a little earlier, right? Mm-hmm. You feel like you're turning over and it's the new leaf. It's halfway through the summer, so you could start racing some crits so that it feels a little more like cyclocross season is around the corner. Yeah. Especially I know some people who are worried if they don't have slightly more energy-specific training leading into events. It's not necessarily for, not everybody has to do it, but some people mentally, it makes them more sound doing some kind of slightly more specific things leading into what their true love is.
And that's a good way to do it, is to continue with your training path. But then, as you get closer to cross season, hit some of those late season crits, because that isn't going to throw off your training, right? Nope. It's a crit. You can toss that in, replace a workout, even supplement one. Yeah. And then, you can still be focusing on doing what you need for training, but then also get that benefit that you want just from doing, a quick crit. That's why I like short races. I know that like most people don't like short races, it seems like these days. Like everything seems like it's just going longer and longer and longer. Big long gravel stuff. I get it. Yeah. But man, like short racing is so great because
it's really fun.
It's like I can get more time with my family. I can train for it, and it doesn't, take, any sort of really long demands or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. You want to push out your tolerance for pain, go short.
Yeah.
Short races will make you tougher, plain and simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Make short races great again. Let's go into...
We need a hat.
Yeah, we need a hat. Maybe not a red one, but we need a hat. All right, Mary says, I just started cycling in June 2019 and just finished my first ride yesterday, Grasshopper Series Low Gap. I loved it and can't wait for the Hopper next month. I used the plan builder for this race. Would you recommend following the same one? So I assume what she means is basically like repeating the same progression that she had coming into that. She says, I love your podcast and couldn't have completed this ride without this great training program and with the support from my husband. So kudos, Mary. Way to go. That looked like a really wet and nasty day.
Looked hard.
Yeah, that's close by for us, just over the hill, basically over into California there. And yeah, that looked pretty miserable. And also shout out to a friend of the podcast, Jeff Kabush, who sneakily, just like Jeff does, he's a very sneaky guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he ended up snagging the win from Stetna and some other scalps. So pretty cool. Okay, so the question of basically, because I've seen a lot of people, they get to this point and they basically said, I used Plan Builder, I did my race, what do I do now? There's probably a couple things they could do, right, Pete? Like two kind of ways you could go about it.
Yeah, it kind of depends on how long your season is and how many more races you have. I think the important part is Plan Builder can backdate when you started training and do that. When you started training, put Plan Builder in as that's your start date, and then put in all your events. Yeah. Every single event you have for the whole year, put them all in, and it accommodates that.
Yeah, it'll trend your fitness through all of those events. And then you can also add events in post.
Yes.
And then it'll say, like, do you want to recalculate this? And it'll basically go through and recalculate your plan. So I would absolutely, so there are two ways to do that, right? Like you can either plan it from the beginning, like you said, and everybody should have all of their races on there.
Always.
Yeah, exactly. Always put them on your calendar, and Plan Builder will work with them. And then if you add races in, because I've found myself in that, have you before, Chad, too, where maybe you missed your peak in one regard, or you didn't perform like you wanted to, or you performed really well, and suddenly you're like, okay, that was great on one day, but I want more races.
Oh, sure.
Because I'm like, I got peak fitness. Bring them at me, right?
It's pretty motivating.
Yeah, so you can just tack them on. It's pretty easy. Throw it in, and then Plan Builder will look at where you started, where you've been, and then take you through it. So that's a good way to do it, Mary. Some content pieces really quick that we published this week that I want to talk about. First of all, we already talked about the race analysis video that we have, but we posted up the one from last week with you, Pete, which is pretty awesome. We talked about positioning and moving through a field, which is really cool. And that was from Hateville, Georgia.
It was
close by copywriter Jesse's house, which is pretty cool. But we also published one on low volume training on how to get faster with shorter workouts. Because basically, this is a really interesting thing that we see constantly. A lot of people, they end up picking a lower volume than they planned or than what they did previously when they rode without structured training, and then they see more improvements. It's really common. And then the always very common question of, can I get ready for a long event with a short race? That blog post talks about that very thing. Or
energy systems.
Training. Exactly.
Again.
Energy systems. Rest week, nutrition, what to eat one on what to eat to recover and get faster. Because we talked about that a couple of podcasts ago, but we wanted to put it down in writing so then people could reflect back on that and see that. Because it's a super important one. It's probably not the time to start, splitting hairs and trying to shave body composition in the middle of a training block just because you have a recovery week, right? So then we talked about mountain bike outside workouts. So basically, that's a big question we get again. How in the world do I do outside workouts or follow my training plan when I ride a mountain bike outside? Because trails are complex. They don't have fit, everything else. So we took the Coach Chad approach of good, better, best, and we outlined a good, better, or three options, good, better, best, on what you can do to follow that. And of course, it uses outside workouts because now you can follow your TrainerRoad plan outside. You just send it to your Garmin or Wahoo and it's done. And if I could personal plug, the watches are awesome for mountain bikes because then when you crash, you usually don't snap your head unit off. I've done that plenty of times. And
you can check your heart rate while you're laying on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The watches are really good for mountain biking for that reason. And the workout interface is actually really good on my Garmin watch. I have the Forerunner 945 and I've tried it on the 935 as well. And it's actually really good. So shows you where you're at, gives you your targets, even gives you describes what the interval is as it's counting down. So then you can look at that and understand what it is in those terms, then gives you the targets. Really good. So do your workouts outside with that. And the final one that we have, all of those are videos that we ended up putting up. I got that backwards with written content. We have a Plan Builder Dirty Kanza post, how to use that, just some different scenarios on how Plan Builder works for Dirty Kanza, how to use seasons for year-round cycling fitness, because that's a really underutilized feature in my opinion.
Especially right now. It's like the perfect time to be looking at all your seasons and how you stack up over time.
Yes, exactly, right? Because it's, basically the way that this works is we were always frustrated with having to look at PRs on a yearly basis because it's like first of all, if I started training at a different time one year to the next, who cares what I am at year over year?
Not useful comparisons.
Right?
Yeah.
And then the other side of it too is I don't get PRs until I get to peak fitness. Because I set my PRs last year at peak fitness time, so then I have to wait a whole year to see if my training's working.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
That's frustrating. So we made a feature with TrainerRoad so that you can separate your training and your calendar into any season you want. So
as many as you want.
Yes. So Jesse actually went onto the forum and asked different people what they used it for. So people talked about, I actually had a power meter that I got on one bike and then I got it on another bike. So I separated those into seasons. Then I could compare those. Another person said bike fit. So basically I did a season when I had my TT fit and then I had a season where I had my tri fit. And I wanted to be able to compare those. When a person was sick or took time off the bike, they kind of isolated and time boxed that time, so they could cut that out and they'd be able to see it and compare it to different things. Tons of different tips kind of on how people use seasons and how you can to get a better picture to know if your training is actually working right now, which is really cool. So yeah, you can check that out. And we even broke down the tips that you have on the moving through the field efficiently. We broke that down on the blog too.
I
Megan did.
That's awesome.
Pretty
I
awesome.
have a lot of catch up. Jeez.
Oh yeah.
Chad,
Missed a
welcome
week
back.
and I'm way
Lots of
backlogged.
stuff. So check that out. It's blog.trainerroad.com. Jesse and Megan are putting out awesome content. They're really great. So yeah, check that out. Okay, let's go into Patrick's question. It says, what are the training benefits, if any, to commuting in a city or urban environment? I live in London and commute 14 miles total per day, a few days a week. I keep it zone 1 and 2, and the rides are all stop and start due to traffic and lights. It's about 35 minutes each way. I know a lot of commuting is, and he says in quotes, junk miles from a training perspective, but as an environmentalist in an overcrowded city, riding to work is socially responsible. Couldn't agree more. He says, is there any benefit to this riding? It's clearly not helping muscular endurance, or could it be helping my aerobic base? Could it substitute for aerobic trainer rides? There must be something positive about this riding. It says, P.S. I broke my shoulder very badly last summer, requiring major surgery, and since then, TrainerRoad has got me back up to speed and probably faster than ever. 5 stars. Good to hear, Patrick. So, commuting, another really common question that we get.
Yeah, and so often people just jump to the whole junk miles description, and it's unfair. You need to draw a distinction between additional mileage being junk and being productive. I mean, it can be supplementary and in doing so very complementary to your training. It's it's easy for it to become junk if it's a little unstructured, or it doesn't even have to be structured, but if it's unproductive and misguided, that's when you can start calling it junk miles. But man, just because you're getting on the bike and it doesn't slot into a workout description, or you're not chasing a particular adaptation, doesn't mean it's junk. And you can absolutely, in fact, all the suggestions you made, there are definitely benefits. It can help muscle endurance. It does improve aerobic base, especially if you're supplementing the other workouts. And it absolutely can substitute for your aerobic trainer rides.
Yeah. I think that when commuting can easily become bad is when you are chasing Strava KOMs on the way to work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can make it
misguided,
unproductive. I mean, those things do, I think, push it more to the realm of junk miles than complementary additional aerobic training or just training, period.
Yep. Yeah. Pete, you, when you lived in Denver before this, you commuted basically every day?
Yeah,
right?
Basically every day for a couple of years. I worked in downtown Denver, and I'm not going to drive a car to, you're right. And it was about somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes every day. And I think there's some real positives, like we talked about, is that, man, you show up to work mentally refreshed and like ready to go, which is worth it for a lot of people, even totally beside the training point of view. And I was actually thinking about it this morning. Commuting Titans, actually, Amber would be really proud. It's a great place to practice your skills and pay attention to what's happening around you. As a crit racer, I used to always joke that like riding down Broadway in downtown Denver is just like racing a crit. You know, I had to pay attention to like 30 things all at the same time. And I'm not going to get plowed by the bus or watch that car turn right in front of me. You know, it's just because it's not training. You can still get better as a cyclist, right?
Yeah, it reinforces that sense of hyper awareness that you have to have in a race situation.
Exactly. And being a commuter, I think commuting makes you a better cyclist, period.
Couldn't agree more.
One of the things that I did do pretty frequently is I would commute to work and not call that training. That was just opening my mind up for work. And then I would bring all my training clothes to work. I would change when I got off. I would go train, come back to work, grab my backpack, and ride home. And then so the commute home was always just butter at the end of my ride, right? I would ride it super easy, 100 or 150 watts, just an extra 20 minutes of tempo, or even easier.
And you mentioned that you would look forward to that over the end of the day, too.
Yeah, exactly. It's, you know, that you get to train as soon as you get off, which is fun, especially when you're leaving work. It capitalized on being somewhere. Like, I didn't have to go home, change, do it all. Then you get home and you're done. Your training's done, your commute's done, your work's done. It all works really well. But I definitely never counted my commute as training. I think that was one of the distinctions I made after probably 6 months, and it made a big difference as it was always bonus.
So icing on the cake.
Yeah, icing on the cake. I always got my work done, and then I commuted in addition to that, and I tried to never go hard during my commute so that I could always leave something on the table for training.
And similarly, I didn't refer to it as training either. When I went without a car for a couple of years, I just rode my bike everywhere, and I still race bikes. But I allotted no time to training. All I did was ride my bike everywhere, including the laundromat with big heavy bag of laundry on my back, and I was always reasonably race fit. I wasn't riding at the same level that I ascended to later, but I was still riding pretty competitively with competitive riders, and that was just from riding my bike around town, and yes to the bike handling thing, and yes to riding in traffic and having to be crazy aware of everything that's going on around you. There's so much going on. There's so much information, just like being in a mass start race.
Yeah, I think where commuting becomes potentially damaging is when you're running I guess everything so tightly to the tape with your training so that you're on your limits, and any extra time basically like you're training so much that you have nothing left in reserve, and you just have to maximize your recovery efforts in between, and you're really running on the fine line there. That's one thing, right? But even then, if you're just lightly spinning and it's a very short commute, it may not be damaging to you. There's also the other side of it. So I'm going to play devil's advocate to this. There's the other side of it too. If you look at it and you basically say like, all right, if I commute, and in this case, in Patrick's case, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But if you commute and it takes you an hour each way to commute, right? But if you could otherwise get to work in any way that would take you 10 minutes to commute, something like that, then that, you might be able to take that time, then wrap that up into training, and then get more like productive structured training in, right?
Yeah.
So it really depends on the person's scenario. For me personally, I find a huge amount of psychological benefit of just riding my bicycle, just spinning around.
Yeah.
And for me, at least right now, the way that I get that is by riding with my son. It's fantastic. Like we just spin around in the backyard or at the park or anything else, and it's extremely therapeutic. Just part of riding a bicycle, I think, even the motion of riding a bicycle. But once we'll be moving this summer, and we'll be moving closer to the office with a safer commute and everything else. And when that happens, I anticipate I'll be commuting basically every day. It's just because of the psychological benefit that I find that it gives me. However, if I'm really running it down and it's like getting really hard with my training, I'm probably going to take the seat in my car and go in that way.
That's the first thing to go.
Exactly, right?
Yep.
If you have the option.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. Daniel, or maybe I'll just get an e-bike because that'll make it even easier, right?
Let's not open that can of worms.
All right. Daniel says, longtime listener and user of TrainerRoad. I love your product and what it's done for my fitness over the years. I have a really simple question. I've just done the workout monitor, which is a sweet spot interval session where within the intervals, the intensity fluctuates ever so slightly up and down. So I'm going to, if you're watching right now, I'll try to kind of envision this. Maybe producer Tucker can even bring up the workout. So if you're watching a live stream, you can see it. He's amazing.
He's so fast.
He's so good, right? But if you're listening, I'll basically describe what you can see on screen here when producer Tucker shares his screen. So these are like sweet spot intervals where assume it's something like 12 minutes and you'll have 3 or 4 kind of that chunked up into 3 or 4 bits, and they'll slightly ramp upward, slightly ramp downward, all a very small amount, and it'll keep you within that sweet spot zone and where we want you to be working. But it just kind of breaks it up, and they're just ever so slightly ramping up and down, something like that, right, Chad?
Yep. Yeah, it's narrow range, 88 to 94%. Sometimes they're 88 to 92, really tight.
Yep. So Daniel's question says, my question is why the sessions are programmed like this. It's not like they're over-under intervals where the changes are more pronounced or you're crossing over some sort of point, right? Like with over-unders. If I'm not looking at my phone while doing it, I don't even notice the minute changes to me, or the minute changes. Thanks, Chad. Sure. To me, all it seems to do is make it more difficult to see how long left until the end of the interval, because the clock is usually just counting down to the minute until the next minor shift. Is there some benefit I'm missing to this? Why not just make it 6 flat 6-minute intervals? There are a few sessions like this, and I'm always puzzled slightly. I guarantee you people are like yelling right now, whatever they're listening to. They're like, you're crazy. Because we hear so much feedback that people are like, those are my savior in those sort of intervals.
Yeah, so first off, you can always find an alternative where it is just that. Flat. Just 10-minute block, 12-minute block, 20-minute block, whatever. Yep. They're out there. So just swap something else in if you don't like those changes. But those changes... I've done a lot of time riding bikes indoors. And I've done a lot of time watching the clock, a lot of time feeling good, not feeling so good. And anything that helps me get through a workout, has in some way, and probably in a number of workouts, made its way into the TrainerRoad workout catalog.
Yep.
So this is just based on learning. And what I learned in this case was that even though these changes are marginal, I mean, they're super slight, that introduces just a little bit of variety and helps me minimize my focus down to shorter stretches of time. I mean, especially as say like a 4x10 workout in the sweet spot, by the time you hit that third and fourth interval, knowing that you have another 10 minutes is a lot more difficult to mentally compartmentalize than knowing I got to get through 2 minutes and then I'm going to get through 3 minutes and then I'm going to get through 1 minute and then 4 minutes. I mean, it's
just take it 2 minutes at a time.
It's a subtle thing, but it makes an impact.
Oh yeah.
And then furthermore, I mean, and this isn't, it's the more you train, the more you become, I think, accustomed to the little subtle nuances that take place when you're working in a narrow wattage range. I mean, the difference between 88 and 90% of your threshold, you can start to differentiate that and recognize that subtle shift. And then when you start pushing up closer to threshold and you're working at 92% versus 94%, that's less subtle. You start to notice, wow, I go up just a couple percent and this gets noticeably harder. And then the difference, this whole sweet spot spectrum that we use being 88 to 94, the difference between 88 and 94, it's only 6%, but you can ride a lot longer at 88% than you can at 94%. And it's not a big change, but man, the toll it takes on you is vast.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm very susceptible to this. If I'm doing sweet spot, which is already hard for me, and it's 90 or 92%, I'm dying 1,000 deaths, 1,000. And so as it rolls back down, like 6 watts down to 88 or whatever, I'm like, oh, really?
It's totally different.
Yeah, it's like the sun comes out, the room cools down a little bit.
Yeah.
But if I had to do flat blocks, I would just explode.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and like to put numbers on that, just let's round everything just to make the math a little bit easier. But if you had a 300 watt FTP and the difference between 90 and 95%, I mean, you're talking the difference between 270 watts and 285 watts. That's a 5% threshold or 5% percentage difference, but we're talking 15 watts that is very meaningful.
Yes.
Very.
Yeah. Ask me to ride at 275 and then ask me to bump it up and ask me if it's meaningful. I'll let you know, right? In those moments, it definitely feels that way.
And back to the whole, you know, I've done a lot of these and I try to figure out ways to make it a little more manageable psychologically. You'll see a lot with maybe shorts or just VO2 max workouts. I'm really keen on 7 intervals because 7 intervals means there's a halfway point or a distinct peak.
Yeah.
So you get through 3 and then you know the next one's the hump and then you only have 3 to go. Just any way that I can break things up and you don't want to look at 13, although I use 13 also, but I'm getting off point here. But any way that makes it, okay, I know the first 2 are a little tough because I'm coming off a recovery valley, but then that third one I start to feel good again, and then the fourth one I'm halfway through it, and then I just have 3, 2, 1, and I just banged out that third one, so now I only have 2 left. Now I'm down to my last one.
Yep.
Set's over. So there is intention behind just about all of this.
From a coach's perspective, you're trying to, once again, hitting on energy systems. That seems to be the theme of this episode, and basically all of our episodes, honestly. But if a goal for a coach is to make their athlete spend a specific amount of time in that energy system, and if whatever we can do in terms of the workout structure to make that more possible for more people, we'll be making more of you faster. So that's our goal, right? We just want to make people faster. So this is one way. And you know, it's funny because when I first started training, not very long thereafter, I started using TrainerRoad, right? When I first started cycling, basically, period. And it taught me how to manage pacing in whether it's, you know, going up a climb, whether it's just a long, steady effort like a TT or the solo break, anything like that. It always taught me to break it into manageable chunks because it can be so daunting psychologically to go about it the rest. And, you know, to kind of add, I guess, a bit of information or I guess personal experience to this too. It's your psychological state when you're riding your bike, or your ability to cope with things psychologically is massive to performance. It's huge, and that's one of the things that gets trained during the training process. It's not entirely physical, right? Like we're training the mind as well. And when you talk about performance and being able to do that, you know, if you talk about like what you can do for 20 minutes. You'd be surprised how far out you can stretch what you can do for 20 minutes. And like your body is physically capable of doing it, but the mind many times is what says, no, sir,
and
too much.
If you'll indulge me, this is an extreme example, but Ironman triathletes, let's say Kona in particular. I mean, these aren't people who are hopping on their bike thinking, okay, I got 112 miles, cool. That's all I'm going to focus on, just ticking them off. They're thinking, I need to transition. I need to get up Palani. I need to get out on the Queen K. I need to get to the turn to the Energy Lab. I need to get to the turn to Havi. You know they're breaking it down. I mean, they're not looking at 112 miles, and I'll look down, oh, geez, 110 still to go. That's deflating, demoralizing.
They're like 148 miles total. Let's count them down one by one, right? Like,
hey, here we go. One. Check.
Oh, I would die. Yeah, I couldn't do it.
That's too daunting.
Yeah, so in this case, Daniel, it's there to help you to help you cope with the workload that you're doing in the workout. To make it seem easier in that regard, but also to teach you the fact that you may be more capable at riding at 95% and 90% than you think you are.
Yeah, those are important distinctions to make too. When you recognize that, you know, I can sit forever at 92% of my threshold, but when I bump it up to 94%, man, the wheels start to come off the wagon way sooner than I'd like. And it's not a big difference in terms of, you know, what you might do in a race, but it can be a real meaningful one.
Yeah. I call them confidence boosters, right? Like when I do those, it's like, sure, like throw a 20-minute at me. If I can break it up into 2-minute chunks. I can do anything. Yeah. So Maria says, I've been racing in a Cat 2 equivalent group for about a year now and have been using the podcast as well as race analysis videos to improve, and they have made a huge difference.
That's awesome.
That's the TrainerRoad system right there. Planning, training, and analytics. And the analytics portion is absolutely the race analysis as well.
Education.
Yeah.
Don't forget.
Everything that you do, you should be looking back at it critically and improving, right? So this past weekend, I completed a 95-kilometer flat road race with only 575 meters of elevation gain. Race day was very windy with crosswinds almost everywhere and short, punchy hills whenever the wind decided to not blow. It's weird how that happens, right?
Sounds like a race.
Yeah, exactly. It says there were a few riders who ripped the field apart in these crosswinds by surging on the front and pulling everyone along with nowhere to hide, forcing people to tail off. Sounds like they were probably guttering people, right? So, you know, if the wind's coming in one direction, if it's coming off of it's hitting you on the left, those riders are probably moving as far as they can to the left side of the road to give people no opportunity to hide from that wind, you know, in their echelon, so to speak. So he says, I ended up in a group of 2 riders triple T'ing the last 45 minutes of a 2-hour and 33 race. What can I do to and I think that he means off the back too, right?
I think so.
Yeah. It says, what can I do to deal with the surges and crosswinds? They were tactically good by riding on the side of the road, giving you no draft. Counterattacking would have sent me off the back earlier, meaning that he was probably already on the physical limit, right? The only thing I did try was take the corners faster than everyone using Pete's method of rolling up to the side when getting close to the corner and choosing the best line. And this saved my legs, the surge of coming out of the corner.
And warms my heart.
Well done. Yeah. Pete's helping people hold on. But that's about it. So for reference, I'm 183 centimeters, 84 kilograms with an FTP of 290 watts. 5 stars all around. So fairly high FTP.
Yeah, and he's pretty similar to Chad and I's size. I mean, more or less. I'm a couple centimeters taller and a couple kilograms heavier.
Yep.
But yeah, it's kind of conserving momentum like you were doing through the corners is step one. Since you've got that, we can kind of break into the tactics of crosswinds and guttering and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, Chad, I mean, you've raced in plenty of races also in Nevada, so therefore in the wind, because that's just what we end up dealing with.
Is there anywhere without wind?
Yeah,
I mean,
right?
Every race I seem to do.
Yeah. And you're also a bigger rider with a stronger FT or a higher FTP than most, I would say. You're higher than average, or you have been at least all throughout your racing career.
At times, yeah.
Yeah.
Not right now.
So I'm sure that you, like, let's flip the tables a bit. Maybe, and we can look at this from the perspective of basically what you would want to do to hurt a rider if you were the stronger rider, like the things that you would do basically to stop a person. Then we can kind of go into his scenario of what he should do to be more efficient and everything else. But if we're in crosswinds and you see little Jonathan in the race with you, what would you do to make it difficult for me?
Well, guttering, obviously. I mean, if that's an option, I'm going to get as far over into the wind as possible so that I'm, or vice
away
versa.
From the wind,
away from the wind.
Yep.
It's been a little while. Yeah, the wind works. But I don't want to create the opportunity for someone to be able to leech off me, to draft off me. It's not an easy thing to do in all situations. So application of power, typically, if I'm the stronger rider, I'm going to do what I can to shake these riders or at least beat them up in the meantime. And if I'm the one leading, then maybe I'm a bit more powerful pulling through each time, such that they have to scramble a little bit to get back on my wheel. I'm struggling here because I'm having to envision a 2-rider TT and what I would do to shake that other rider. Not that I'd want to in this instance. But,
and I think one thing that everybody should know is in Crosswinds, it's not a snap. It doesn't just kaboom and everybody's gone. It's this like they're turning up the temperature on the pot, and everybody's struggling more and struggling more and struggling more, and then it's just like a popcorn kernel. It's just one, and it's like boop, and then just gone. And so when there is a group of savvy riders riding the front of a crosswind, it's holding on for as long as possible and never. Or if you are doing it, if you're on the front, you have to do it for as long as possible to get rid of the most people you possibly can.
Yep.
So it's not I'm going to do 500 watts for 5 minutes and then it's done. I'm finished. It's pretty much once the crosswinds start, you stay on the power until the race is over.
And one thing to keep in mind with this is if a rider has a lower threshold, and usually you can generally assume that if they're a smaller rider, they're probably going to have a lower threshold. Not always the case, but generally, if that's the scenario, you always have to remind yourself that, if the wind is adding plus 60 watts, let's just say to everybody, that plus 60 watts is probably hurting the smaller person more than it's hurting you.
Yeah, it's a greater percentage of their threshold.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So in that case, that when you talked about, application of power, Chad, and doing that, when the wind is strong, that's the time for you to really hurt those riders. As long as if they're perfectly in your draft, then you're just hurting yourself. Mm-hmm. But if they are exposed to the wind in some degree, and that's like the worst. When I've been riding with big riders and they really put down a lot of power, when I'm already just fighting to hang on because I'm exposed to the wind, I'm gone.
You have to hold that draft unrealistically tightly to not suffer any of the consequences of that crosswind. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be a steady thing that only comes from one angle. So you're constantly shifting your position, which means every now and again you're going to put yourself in a position where you have to do more work than you want to be doing, and it only lasts so long.
You're sailing, right? Like a skipper is never just constant. He never just sets things up and then just keeps going. Always adjusting, and you have to be always adjusting in that. And surging power, honestly, makes it really hard. Like for me, and I'm a surgy rider, but in those scenarios when I have big riders that are really just like hammering, and if like it's got like some egos at the front that are just trying to push, see how hard they can push. Goodbye.
And
like it really hurts.
Know that crosswinds are difficult, and they're difficult for everybody. It doesn't matter how big, how powerful you are. They hurt. They hurt real bad. So you're not the only one out there suffering. So psychologically, keep that in your back pocket.
Yes, that's a really good point. And we should transition to what we would do to try to hold on, I guess. Yeah. Because that's the psychological side of things is massive, because you decide when you're done. At least like, I know you may feel like you're physically done, but like you decide when enough is enough.
Yeah.
And that's a really big point to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think there's some tips that you can, air quotes, tips you can use for riding crosswinds. Generally speaking, I would say starting your own echelon behind a real serious crosswind hammerfest, you effectively just lost the race.
Why do you say that? That's a good point.
As soon as you give up, you're assuming that other people who couldn't make the front echelon are going to work harder than the people in the front to pull you back to the front of the race.
It doesn't really work that way.
So you're basically kind of like announcing like, hey, I'm the one that's going to pull this along.
Yeah, I'll start the new echelon. I'll do a lot of work. If you guys help, we might be able to catch the 5 guys that were stronger than us before this to get back up to the front of the race. And that's just, it probably works sometimes, but I've never been in that scenario where we caught them. But what you can do is, instead of putting your chips in the start a new echelon basket, put your chips in the make the front echelon basket. Go all in. And I would say if there's a couple guys really rotating, they're probably giving a little bit of shelter. They might be 6 inches or a foot off the gutter. See if you can get yourself into that 3-person mini echelon and ride up the side, ride in the wind. You're going to have to do it. You might as well do it earlier. So when the the curtain comes down in the crosswinds, get to the front as fast as possible and use up all your energy that you have, because if you get dropped, you're still in that same echelon you were going to be in anyways, that you put your hand up and you're like, I'll pull us all back. So,
and there is rest up there.
Yeah, there is rest.
That's an important thing to remember, that like when you get up there, relatively speaking, there is rest up there.
It's the most restful place in the whole in the whole race is the front 3 guys.
Yep.
So remember that, and put a lot of effort into getting into that front echelon, and then take your pull, get to the front, and you will get, a chunk of rest. And all of a sudden it's like, well, I could probably do a pull again because I'm not guttered. And then you're in that group. You definitely don't want to be the last guy that's being tailed, or the last couple riders being tailed off that front group. So always put more effort into the beginning of when the crosswinds hit to get to that front echelon. Even if you blow yourself up and you get dropped, you're still in the same position you would have been in.
Yeah.
By giving up.
That's a really good point.
On the how you were talking about making constant adjustments, being really tidy with your placement relative to the other riders and crosswinds, you just have to be constantly doing that, right, Chad?
And that's a very acquired skill. It does not come naturally. I've met, I think I can think of one rider in my time who just knows how to find that spot. We all know Steve Thompson. He's really good at finding that sweet spot. But everybody else, and I'd be willing to bet Steve makes it look easy, and he's probably working as hard as we are. But you have to just constantly be feeling for it, and you can't tune out. You can't get complacent, because the second you do, you're probably taking more wind than you need to if you just made this slight alteration in your position.
Yep.
So it's this constant, ever-changing sort of positioning battle.
And we're talking like an inch or 2 in a direction for everybody who's
Subtle.
listening. It's so small, but it's probably a difference of 10, 20, 30 watts in the actual scenario we're talking about, which is huge.
Anticipate the direction of travel too, because it's not very often that you're on a dead straight road with a wind that's coming at a consistent yaw. I mean, the road is going to change position, which means you have to change position. The wind is going to change position a bit. You have to change with it.
Yep. With that, I think an important thing, like what I imagine many times, I have like little wind veins on different parts of me, like it's like
the string,
the
tied.
little the little ribbon or whatever. So like you should be feeling the wind on every part of you. You should feel it on the front wheel. You can always feel that, because if your bike is ever getting unsettled, that's because it's hitting the front wheel and the pressure differential that exists with that front wheel. In fact, there's a blog article, you can go to blog.trainerroad.com, where Jesse actually wrote on this, where he broke down the science of crosswinds kind of, and how to ride well in crosswinds. When your front wheel starts to feel like it's turning or things are getting unstable, that means the wind's hitting your front wheel. So let that be an indicator. That's like one wind vein. You absolutely can feel it on your head and face. That's one for sure. Pay attention to what you're feeling on your hands. Pay attention to what you're feeling even on like your hips, everything else. Like you can feel wind. And if you're really paying attention to where you can feel it, you can find spots where you're minimizing where you feel that, right? And making yourself more efficient.
Hide from it.
And along those lines on hiding, look for, and you can't really say road furniture necessarily, but we're talking about trees, buildings, everything else. When you see it, if it's brutal crosswinds, then you're coming up to a spot that's basically aisled with trees on either side of it. That's a spot where you know that you can maybe rest a bit, but it also might be a really good opportunity for you to move up a bit, because I bet other people are thinking that, it's time to rest. So if you're kind of stuck in a bad spot, that's a time to move up. Be always heads up about like what is surrounding you on the course to be able to try to move ahead. I think that's one tip for sure.
Yeah. And I think the one last thing is when it is totally echeloned out like that, and there's just a string of riders, we call it the half draft. Riding directly next to somebody is taking like a small percentage of the wind that you would have been hit. So riding up along the line when everybody, even though you're all sheltering the riders next to you as you go past them, it's a way better move than going 6 feet over and sprinting to the front of the echelon. Ride up as close as you can, the string of riders back to the front of the echelon, and it's saving you. I mean, it's the little things like that matter.
Call back to the very beginning of this podcast when we were talking about the differences between high and low category races and everything else. That's one thing you'll see in higher category racing is the riders are much more tightly organized, especially if you go into like a Masters 1-2 field where they've had a lot of race experience. They're rubbing elbows all the time. They're not upset with each other.
As those fitness margins get smaller and smaller, things like this have to come into play. You have to get really comfortable riding very close to many other riders.
Yeah, there's a lateral draft, right? That everybody has. It's not. It's they're punching kind of like a teardrop shape, and then it leaves whatever tail it has behind it.
Yeah.
And then wind affects that for sure. So you have to envision that kind of to understand where they're at, but always trust the fact that if you're closer to that person, you're going to be better off.
You're going to be better off.
Yep. Yeah. And it's tempting though sometimes when we want to attack because we're like, or we want to make some sort of move. It's really tempting to not be diligent with that, especially because a lot of the time I think subconsciously we just see what we see in racing, and the most common thing or the most pronounced pulling away from a group that we see is when a person is done with a lead out or attacks on a climb, something like that, and they pull way away from somebody.
Yeah.
That's not the time to pull away. That's the time to stay close.
And pay attention, right? If you're riding really fast along a group of riders who are already on their limit, you have to pay attention, because if someone pulls off, they're going to pull into you. So,
yes.
It's not a fail-safe mechanism for moving up. It's just like everything else. There's risks along with it, but it's, again, like, pay attention. And like, I think you can tell when people are excited for Crosswinds.
In a bike race, there's no time for complacency. You can't just kind of zone out. I mean, that's when crashes happen. That's when mistakes happen. That's when you get tailed off, things of that nature.
Yep.
We still have 4 more really good points.
All right, Chad,
let's cover them.
No, these are yours. I want to hear them, and I want to contribute where I can.
Yeah, so I think we're going to transform back into the echelon. The whip crack effect is where the strongest riders kind of migrate to the front. It's because they're paying attention the best. They have the fitness, and they just know what's happening. And anybody who's abreast of what's happening in a race is going to be a better racer. So if you find yourself at the back, you probably did a couple things incorrectly to get there. So think about what you did, like that we were talking about, examining your race after the fact and what you could have done differently. In a crosswind section, you should pretty much know that it's windy. You know what the race course is like, so you should be able to know the positioning battle to get to the crosswinds is probably what I would call the crux of the race. Even if it's not going to be crosswindy, being there and saying, oh, the wind's not as bad as I thought it was, is a great scenario to be in. It's not you get there and then the fight begins. The fight is to get there and then the race begins.
Yeah, as Amber says, it's one of the many selections that's going to take place. That is a selection.
That is a selection. So if you are in the back, figure out what you could have done differently to be at the front at that race. And if you are in the back when the crosswinds hit, like, it's the alarm bells, and you have to do everything you possibly can, including throwing away your race to get to the front, because it's already thrown away if you don't do that.
Yep. The back, and it's almost always fair to assume the back is going to be a harder place than the front.
Always.
Like, so, if you find yourself, that should be your goal, is to get up there.
Yeah.
One thing too is, like, the people that you're around can entirely change your echelon experience. Like, the 3 riders ahead of you may be like, this is great, and you may be suffering, or vice versa. And it's just because you're around either a small rider that isn't giving you enough draft, a surgy rider that just isn't smooth, so as a result you're constantly having to surge. That makes things really tough. Or it could just be a rider that's making it difficult on you for one reason or another, right? Like, the riders you're around, if you're having a very hard time in an echelon, or even in any group scenario, before you think that this entire race is extremely hard and I'm not fit for it, think, okay, well, who am I around, and can I shift my position?
Yeah, this is Pete's point that I think is a super sharp point, is proactively reshuffling. Don't just think that this is my spot in the pace line or the echelon and I have to stay here for the entirety of it. Feel free to move around, rearrange things. If you're behind that, or if you're on the side of that small rider and it's not working for you and you're falling apart, move. Fold yourself somewhere else into that echelon.
The mantra of sorts that I have for that, and I think this runs through my head in every race, is think outside the race. And I always try to think that way. That was with motocross and skiing. I was really bad at just always following whatever line was apparent in front of me, right? And, okay, so this is a straightaway. So straight in the middle, a turn, and now we go straight again, a turn, and we go straight again. And if you think outside the race, so to speak, in that regard, suddenly you start to see the line that you can piece together through everything that is smooth and flowing. And there's never a straight and a turn, a straight and a turn. It's just a constant flowing line. It makes you way faster.
It does.
And then the same thing applies to, line choice, sure, for cycling, but also thinking outside your current circumstance in the race, right? Sure. Wherever you're at, you don't have to be there. You can actually change things. You can choose how you want to reshuffle that deck.
Yeah, and the sooner you realize that you need to reshuffle, the better you're going to be. And so usually if I'm in a race and I find myself behind someone smaller than I would like to be behind, I just change that right then and there. It probably takes me a couple seconds to realize that that's happening, and then just
don't do that. Don't write it out.
Yeah,
move.
No, it's never worth it. And I think the last thing is it's pretty, depending on where you're racing, who you're racing with, what your racing scene is like, who likes crosswinds and who likes to pedal like that in a crosswind. Like, we know locally.
Yes.
Even if I race in California, or, you can just figure out the way that race is going to be, find yourself near them and like just cue off of them.
Yeah.
Anticipate.
They're this is their most exciting thing they've done in weeks, probably.
Yeah.
So just be near them for when the crosswind hits, and then you're already in the good position. You don't have to like put a bunch of mental energy into the whole battle to get there. You just only kind of have one North Star, and you just sit near or around that person and know that the race is coming.
Yeah, and if you know who those riders are too, it can be pretty encouraging when you just accept when this rider is at the front, it's gonna hurt, but it's not gonna stay there for that long. I can hang on for as long as I need to, because then things are gonna back off a little bit so that I can sort myself out again.
You can anticipate when riders are going to go hard. You really can.
Yeah.
There are times when you'll be caught off, but you won't be caught off guard again by that
Yeah.
person, right? Like you can like make sure you're taking inventory on everybody and taking note of that sort of thing. Hopefully that gives some advice for CrossFit.
Yeah, that was a lot of advice.
Hey, it's all good. Samuel's question: What is the benefit of the rest between 2 by 20-minute intervals? Once again, I think everybody is yelling out, Samuel, why are you asking?
Don't tell
this?
Chad this.
So, what is the benefit of rest between 2 by 20-minute intervals? If I have the mental strength to do the interval intensity for the full time of 40 minutes for 2 by 20 or 60 minutes for 3 by 20, etc., would I see a significant benefit from holding that level of power without rest, or would I see no benefit? Or would I see a detriment, as it would take longer to recover from long term? I really enjoy time trials, and I find that I end up averaging threshold or just under for 45 minutes to 1+ hours. So big red flag right there to me really quick.
Maybe.
And it says, and I'm wondering how this training would compare to doing the more traditional 3 by 20 blocks. Thanks, and I love this podcast and product y'all have, as I've been using it for the past 7 months, and it's bumped me up to 335 watts at 4.4 watts per kilogram.
Nice.
Really
That's
good.
awesome.
And I feel more gains are coming. Okay, I'm sure they are, Samuel. Way to go. So how do we want to tackle this one, Chad?
Okay, so straight out of the gates, let's get one thing clear. We're talking the very nature of intervals. The idea being to accumulate more time at an intensity than you otherwise could if you were to do it in one fell swoop.
Yep.
So this is interval training. I mean, most people can't do 60 minutes at threshold. So we make it, a 5 by 10 and then a 4 by 12 and then, gradually inch up to a 4 by 15, 2 by 30 maybe is down the road a ways. But it's an incremental process because this isn't something that's achievable for most people. So that's why intervals are.
Yep.
And then there's a term in the coaching and athletic power-based community, stamina. And usually this is an interchangeable term with endurance. In most contexts it is. In our context, in the coaching world, it's not an interchangeable term at all. When it comes to power-based training, this is describing a resistance to fatigue, and it's typically below FTP. So when you talk about stamina, it's like I can ride this long at 95%, 85%, 80%, whatever. So you can go a couple of ways about improving race performance or cycling performance. Is that you either elevate FTP so that when that 90% is now at a higher percentage, or is at the same percentage of a higher number, so you're going faster, or if you've either topped out or you just recognize this is all the faster I'm going to get right now, you start to grow your stamina at that percentage. So even with FTP, which is the extreme end of things, we're talking all the way up at what you theoretically could do for an hour. You know how that actually breaks down is that athletes can maintain that anywhere from, and the range is a pretty specific one based on a ton of data, or a lot of athletes, I should say, 39 to 72 minutes. That's a wide range. So you do an FTP assessment and we're estimating hour power. It doesn't mean you can go out and bang out a 60-minute time trial at this effort level.
Sure.
Other things, certain physiologic steady-ish states are what's actually happening. Now, taking that from 39 to 72 minutes is a tall order. So if you can, that might be the case with Samuel here. Maybe he just has top-notch stamina, and he can ride at a very high percentage of threshold for these long durations, even over an hour, which people think flies in the face of what FTP is, but it's not. It's a range. It's not strictly 60-minute power. It's a pretty wide range, brain fade here.
Well, I think the resilience, stamina is really resilience, kind of, right?
It is.
And I know a bunch of different riders who have the same FTPs who have different resiliency levels.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure. And you can train it.
And you can train it just like you can do anything.
There's a psychological component. There's obviously a physiological component.
Oh, yeah.
So we think in terms of, or you now understanding what stamina is, think in terms of stamina versus increasing capacity. So, and when we talk capacity, it could be raising FTP, raising your sprint power, raising your VO2 max power, maybe your 2-minute power, your 2-minute 30 power, 230, whatever, your anaerobic. In any case, capacity versus stamina. So capacity is how high you can go. Stamina is how high or how long you can sustain long durations at high percentages of your capacity. So, and typically base and build is dedicated to improving FTP, making that capacity as high as possible. And it might address certain types of capacity, not just your steady state power, but also those other things that I just mentioned. Then when we start to get into the specialty plans, that's when you start to see really specific emphases, right? And that's where, depending on the plan you're in, I might shift the target to increasing stamina. No longer chasing FTP gains. I just want to make sure that you can ride at, in the case of a 40K TT, 98 to 102% of your FTP for a solid hour. Now we're really focused on growing that stamina. I mean, maybe you are that 39-minute rider who can only last 40 minutes and then you fall apart at FTP. Well, now we're going to try to go up to 42 minutes and 44 minutes, 46 minutes, and maybe your target's a 54-minute time trial. So it's going to have to be 54 minutes at some point. Not really focused on improvements in FTP anymore. Now we're improving stamina. And the same thing can be said with triplans, because they want it's a steady state power. You can only grow FTP for so long. Now I'm heading into my race and I'm an Ironman triathlete and I know I can ride at about 76% of my FTP for this long, but I'm going to be out on course for this long. So I need to grow my stamina to meet that requirement.
Yeah, it's the specialty phase, right? That's exactly what we're prepping for.
Exactly.
Yeah. And even down to like what you talked about, it's not necessarily just sustained efforts. It can be helpful for mountain biking. That's where you specialize too, and that's a different sort of stamina that you're working at. The demands for that race define what that is. So
yeah, exactly. The different durations of triathlon shines a really bright light on that.
Yep.
I mean, you need to be this fast to race a sprint, this fast to race an Olympic, and it gets slower and slower. But obviously, the stamina has to go up and up because you're out there for much longer durations.
So in Samuel's case, basically,
there's one of two things.
Yeah. So like number one, I'm impressed, Samuel. I've never once gone through a 2x20 and been like, didn't need that break.
Should have just done 40.
I should have just cleared the gap. I should have doubled right over it, right?
Never
Bunny
said
hopped
that.
right over it. I've never said that ever. So you're impressive, Samuel. But two possible things I probably think are the case. Either his stamina is exceptionally high, and that's the case. And if that's the case, you're going to be moving through the workouts. And I don't advise you to necessarily rush the process. If you're following one of our plans and it has a specialty plan in place and it's specific for what you're doing, you're using Plan Builder, it's going to walk you through and progress you appropriately. So don't worry, you'll get there.
The workouts will handle that for you.
Yep, and be happy and accept the little rest that you're getting right now.
Yeah, if you're knocking out your workouts, that's awesome. That's ideal.
Yes. You don't need to wear yourself down with every workout.
It doesn't have to thrash you every time. So if no, I think.
You go.
No, I think that's important, and everybody should remember that all the time. Is it should be hard, it should be taxing, but you should be able to do them.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yep. And then depending on where you are in the training cycle, I mean, if you're in a baser build, I would still be chasing FTP improvements, which means I would reassess FTP right now.
Yes.
Because you're shortchanging yourself with these workouts. If at the end of 20 minutes you don't need a break, that 20 minutes at this sound like these are threshold intervals.
Yeah.
That should have been really taxing. You should be watching the clock for those last couple of minutes, just hanging in there, resting, and then gearing yourself up to bear it out again.
Yep.
If, however, you're a 40K TT rider or you're doing a triathlon plan or something where you need to emphasize stamina, you may be right on track. This may be the point where it's really awesome that you can string together these long intervals into solid intervals because that's what you're going to have to go do on the race course. So depending on where you are in your training season, this could be either perfect timing, or this could be a red flag and you need to reassess your FTP.
Yep. Let's go into a handful of live questions, just a few of them today. First one from Risa says, my partner and I both got into Dirty Kanza. Congratulations, Risa. I'm a 2-time finisher. He has ridden 1 century in his life. What can we do to train together without compromising our individual race goals? This is part Dr. Phil, but also part Ask a Cycling Coach. Because, man, I could
We could go a couple directions with this.
Kind of like what you were talking about with Powder Creek Lodge.
Yeah.
Dirty Kansas is going to be a defining moment of the relationship. That's for sure. So, first of all, I think that the best way to do this is if you use Plan Builder and you move forward with where you're at, your plans may be slightly different based on experience levels, but largely I bet that you'll see they'll be pretty similar, especially as you get closer to the event. So there's plenty of time to share there. I think of like Keegan Swenson and Sophia Gomez Villafania. They're partners and they don't train together all the time. But when their workouts coincide enough, or even what they'll do is they'll basically ride together until they get to the spot where they need to do intervals. Then when one starts their intervals, they're like, see ya. And then they'll, meet up once again, or they'll even do things like they'll get to a climb and then they basically say like, all right, one does their intervals, the other one, then they might meet up on the way down, something like that.
Sure. I do bonus mileage. I mean, you're not going to do bonus mileage at Dirty Kansas. I recognize that. but during the training rides, you can. You can do extra mileage and then come back to your less fit partner, or not less fit, but less experienced partner.
Yep. And it sounds like you're going to have different race goals on race day. You probably don't have to worry about refining any sort of like team riding tactics or anything like that, right? Since you probably aren't going to be riding together on race day, it sounds like. But the one thing I definitely would, this is just a personal thing. I find that it can be really easy to put yourself, the internet calls it mansplaining, right? Like where you mansplain to somebody else, basically like, here's how this works because I'm more experienced. And I just think that, especially with a day like Dirty Kansas, who knows what's going to happen on such a long day with so many variables, rather than like going through the process or trying to drag somebody through. I think the most important thing is just to try to enjoy the process of what you're going through when you're talking about training with a partner.
Yeah, and setting them up for success, right? Like giving them some inputs before the race to know, like, here's some things I noticed when I was training, and this is how it impacted my race. Or, since you are experienced, you have the food, you have nutrition, you have pacing, you have a bunch of strategies in place, and it may not exactly work for your partner, but sharing that information in like a nice, helpful, constructive manner over the course of months, and you don't, I'm sure it's something you guys are going to talk about all the time.
Chances are the questions will come up from your partner.
Yes, exactly.
Like you don't have to rush them.
Yes, wait for them to ask you and provide the help that you can, and then wait for them to ask again.
Well, like we talked about this, I think, recently on the podcast, but like when my wife comes back from kickboxing or comes back from anything else like that or does her workout, anything like that, I always want her to tell me about my workout, and I tell her about my workout, and I don't know if she listens, but she smiles and nods, and that's great and really helpful for me because then I feel like somebody else cares about it. So maybe that's just what you need in this case, So
yeah, and when offering advice, this is more, don't condescend and table the self-righteousness, because it doesn't matter how much you know. Nobody wants to be patronized or talked down to.
For sure. Sprints on the trainer, a question from Tom. What are people's approaches to doing sprint intervals on the turbo? Stick it in resistance mode and just adjust the plus or minus icon to get a level where a slow cadence is under load, say 200 watts, and then nail it. I guess I have a hard time answering this one because I don't use erg mode. I just use rollers and it's but effectively it's kind of what you're talking about. I have the resistance is just set. It is what it is, and then I'll shift into a gear where it will require that. I don't work on like standing sprints on the rollers. Strangely, I know, weird, but like seated ones, absolutely. I think there's
so that's first off, make it seated sprints. I don't know that standing sprints are a good idea for anybody.
I don't think so.
I mean, there's too much opportunity for body English, and you really should be utilizing body English with a sprint. So I think it flies in the face of specificity, that's for sure. Seated sprints, however, you can get a lot out of a trainer, and even in erg mode, which is primarily what I do, but I will say that's taken a lot of fine tuning. I know for a 20-second sprint that I'm going to do 5 times over the course of a 30-minute sprint workout what I need to be within a very narrow range. And that takes some fact-finding workouts that I do prior.
I think the one thing that everybody can take away for sprint workouts on the trainer is I would think of them as not like a sprint, but as a bridge effort or something like that. And so I always put myself in a really constructive position, but the same thing I would do in a race or in a fast ride where I'm actually hunkered down, I'm bent over, and I'm tightened up and ready to go. And then I sprint until my form starts to deteriorate, and then I stop. Even if it's supposed to be a 20-second sprint and I last 11 seconds, that extra 5 seconds of getting like a whirly bird and like, who knows, I'm like scared I'm going to fall off the trainer. I just stop and it's fine. And I coast and then I rest and then I do it again. And at the beginning of the season, my sprints really, or my bridge attempts at high wattage, I do them in erg mode. But just do the productive part. Don't force it longer, especially on the trainer. I really don't see any value into forcing yourself into doing something really hard in a position that's not necessarily...
Like, so much of sprinting isn't just necessarily pushing the pedals hard, right? We have a video specifically on that, on how to be a faster sprinter. You can look that up on our YouTube page, but we break down that very thing, and a blog post written by Megan that's awesome when she breaks that down. And even Pete, shout out for seated sprints. The other day, you and I did a sprint workout outside, and like out of the saddle, you and I were pretty close to heads up.
Yeah, it was good.
And then in the saddle, you were almost as fast. It was pretty impressive. I was out of the saddle sprinting next to him, and he was in the saddle, and it was basically the same. So pretty cool.
Yeah, it's something you should practice too. Like, it's another tool you have, right?
Yep.
If you don't have to stand up to sprint every time, I mean, it can only benefit you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, on this episode. Once again, this is episode 243. So if you head over to forum.trainerroad.com, you can look up everything. Producer Tucker will have put in notes and gone through everything there. Stay tuned to our YouTube channel. We're going to have more race analysis coming, more quick clips that you can view and share with other people. And if you're listening to this podcast, you can subscribe to the podcast. I know a lot of you just listen to it ad hoc. If you subscribe to it, you can do that through whatever app you use. That way it's always there in your feed. Then you can usually auto-download or anything else too, so then you can listen to it on the go. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and to our blog. I'd recommend all three. If you want to become a faster cyclist, head over to TrainerRoad.com and check it out there. Also, last thing, if you're watching this on YouTube, which you totally should be, give us a thumbs up if you like this episode and let us know what you would have done to make it better down below. That's it.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks, everybody.
See y'all. Take care.